Okay, Jack, why don't you go ahead and get us started?
All right, great. So good morning, everyone. My name is Jack McDougall, and I'm the president and CEO of the Greater Washington Board of Trade. I'd like to thank you for joining us today on our conversation on emergency preparedness. This is the fourth in a five-part series that we've launched discussing emerging economic threats. And this is a series that's presented by our member, McGuireWoods, and we thank them for that. You know, we're currently seeing an escalation of numerous interconnected threats that are impacting businesses and organizations across the region and the country. You know, these threats, they're evolving rapidly, and we need to be prepared. So in addition to the many risks resulting from the pandemic and long-term risks such as climate change, we're now confronted with serious economic concerns, and the headlines are changing daily. So how do we make sense of all of this? In our previous webinars, we've explored inflation and supply chains, cybersecurity, capital market volatility. In an upcoming event, we're going to talk about energy and resource constraints. And today we're going to focus on regional emergency preparedness on very many different levels. You know, how should organizations respond to breaks in services, you know, water and electricity, transportation and others, you know, a range of things from natural and man-made. You know, and how can businesses better mitigate losses from these potential threats and disasters? And now more than ever, we need to prepare and be resilient. So to help explain and examine the impacts of these threats, we've assembled a really great group of experts for the conversation today. So we have Clint Osborn, the Chief of Operations at the Operations Division for DC Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. We have Jim Sheaffer, the Chairman of the Board of Directors for the American Red Cross National Capital Area. We have Marc, Barbiere, Director, Office of Emergency Management, Georgetown University. And moderating the discussion, Licy Canto, Managing Director, Washington, D.C. and APCO Mid-Atlantic, APCO Worldwide. Okay, thank you all for taking the time to join us today. And now I'll turn it over to Licy to get us started. Licy?
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. Great to be with you here again. As Jack said, whether it's snowstorms, hurricanes, flash flooding, a pandemic, threats to our economy, or even political violence, or so much more, our region, the greater Washington, D.C. Region, faces a myriad of threats and hazardous situations. And how your business responds to these threats, whether you are prepared for the potential impact of them to mitigate the losses and ensure that we are protecting both people and the communities that we serve, is what is going to be the focus of our conversation today. Put another way, how to make sure that we are informed, prepared, and involved in what confronts us collectively as a region. And I'm really excited to have Clint, Jim, and Marc, three of our leading national experts here in the region working on these issues from different perspectives to join us today. So welcome, everyone. I want to jump right into the conversation and ask you, Clint. Clint, as Jack said, as we know, you are overseeing operations, if you will, for the DC Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. First, what is that? What is your background? And then when you think about our issue today, what for you stands out in terms of what makes this region unique to the situations and the threats that we face moving forward? Clint?
Good morning, and thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you and Licy and everybody. So as Licy said, my name is Clint Osborn. I'm the Chief of Emergency Management and Intelligence, or the Chief of Operations and Intelligence at the DC Homeland Security and Emergency Management Agency. And the way I like to explain this to folks is everyone's familiar with FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. And at the state level and at the local level, all across the country, there are similar types of organizations that focus on identifying risks to our community, mitigating those risks. And then when we can't mitigate those risks, when we can't reduce the risk that something will happen, we're also the agency that coordinates in our case, the state and local emergency response and recovery work. And in addition, we have an interesting program called the Fusion Center, the District of Columbia's Fusion Center for Intelligence, which is one of a number of fusion centers across the country that focus on information sharing and intelligence sharing across not just our state and local governments, but also with our partners in the private sector. I think what's interesting about this region from an emergency management perspective, first is within the District of Columbia, we're a unitary government. So we are the state government as well as the county government and the local government. So we have a lot of, across government, we have a lot of the service delivery requirements of all of our local partners throughout the greater Washington area, throughout the Commonwealth of Virginia, the state of Maryland, West Virginia. A lot of our local partners, we clear snow, we haul trash, we fight fires, we provide safety and security to the community through our police, and then we do a lot of work at the human services level through our health department, our human services, and all of the service deliveries. At the same time, one of the unique aspects of our organization and a lot of our district government agencies is that we're also the state level organization for policy and programming. So the pathway between federal initiatives, federal grant programs, and local execution is a spot that we sit at. I think more generally, I think one of the interesting things about this region, one of the things that I've come to really appreciate is how interconnected we are across 3 states, across a number of very, very large counties and cities, and at the same time, how different each of those jurisdictions are. Within the Commonwealth, we have cities that for organizational purposes are the same as counties. In Maryland, it's a traditional state organization where you have cities inside of counties, inside of the state organization. And I think just from an emergency management perspective, it is a challenging area because you have to know a lot of this stuff. But at the same time, I think it's also a community where through organizations like the Board of Trade and our Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments partners, where we have a lot of built-in relationships that we're constantly sort of revisiting and nurturing. So those are some of the, I think, the key aspects of what I think are really interesting about this region.
Marc, Clint talked about our interconnectedness, our community, and with it, the opportunities that exist to have even closer dialogue. As he explained, the region there's a lot happening at the DC table, if you will, which also makes it very complex and making sure that we are as well organized as we can be for emergency preparedness. You at Georgetown spent a lot of time talking about that. What is unique about emergency preparedness when we think about Georgetown, but really the college students community here and across Washington, D.C. What is your focus? Tell us a little bit about what you are doing and how you think about this question of emergency preparedness from an academic standpoint.
Sure, thanks for the question. So I think here at Georgetown and also with my colleagues across the consortium, right, we kind of mirror a lot of what Clint talked about. We have this very collaborative regional dialogue with our partner universities across the district and across Northern Virginia and suburban Maryland. And really our focus is on protecting our little cities within cities and our little counties within counties, right? We have a population that resides on our campus of around 5,000 students during the semester, plus thousands of other students who surround the campus communities. And these folks live here, are educated here. We provide food and spiritual guidance and medical care. We basically provide full service to our community members within the community that we reside, the District of Columbia. And so I think many of the challenges are that our population comes from disparate parts of the country with different levels of understanding of the threats and hazards here in the district. They're not familiar with the community as much as we who are natives or more involved in the community are. And so really we have to kind of focus on building culture of preparedness and educating those community members about disasters and emergencies so that they know what to do when something bad happens, not just here on the campus, but when they leave our campus walls and participate in events downtown and travel around the region and go out into the community. And so I think there are lots of challenges around that, but also opportunities in terms of partnering and educating our community.
Jim Sheaffer, you work with one of the most recognizable organizations in the world, and certainly here in Washington, D.C. Tell us the import of the American Red Cross within our region, and when the American Red Cross thinks about emergency preparedness in the region, what does that look like for you?
Thanks, Licy. Well, the American Red Cross, I think, is probably one of the most recognizable brands in the world. And what we do here in this area when it comes to emergency preparedness and response is play a critical role in the mosaic that Clint laid out. We have a role to play, just as governments and other nonprofits and academic organizations have to play. The American Red Cross is probably best known for response. That's what we do. We fire up when there's a need. But we also fundamentally believe that the best way to be in a position to respond is to be prepared. And that's to be prepared at the governmental level, to be prepared at the business level, and to be prepared at the individual level. So we spend a lot of time trying to help people understand how to be better prepared so that when we respond, we're in a better position. And perhaps the disaster we respond to may not be as traumatic as otherwise might be in the absence of preparedness. I think that from our perspective, a number of things are changing. The size of disasters is increasing. The number of large disasters is increasing. The frequency of disasters is increasing. The fact that disasters are happening at the same time is more noticeable today. And we're also dealing with longer duration disasters, COVID being probably the best or maybe the worst example of that. But so we're in an environment where disasters are coming more frequently, they're bigger, and they happen on top of each other. And that creates a lot of challenges for the Red Cross, and it creates a lot of challenges for business and for individuals in the region.
Clint, Jim talked about the myriad of challenges that we face, and how long we've been facing them. He raised, of course, the one that we're in, among others, right now in terms of the pandemic. How does the region think about confronting that size of a pandemic that I'm not certain that any one of us could have prepared for what we are going through right now? How does the region orient itself? What are some of the things, as you think about your response, Clint, that we've learned over the last 20 years that have helped us to begin to move through this pandemic and its impact here in the region, particularly on businesses?
Well, I think, I think the big takeaway is that a disaster is going to impact everyone, right? And I think, a lot of years ago, right, past 20 years ago, we had civil defense, which was really focused on the concept of whole community, right? And in FEMA, the concept of the whole community is probably going on 20, Marc, check me, 20 years now, right? And so as Jim talked about, I think this idea of, we as individuals can't wait for the government or anyone else to sort of resolve all of our problems for us. And I think that's really important for our businesses, because what we've seen easily for the last 20 years is businesses that prepare survive. There's a really remarkable statistic, and I'm going to butcher it, so I'm just going to paraphrase it, but that businesses that have continuity plans are far more likely to stay in business. Businesses that work with their employees and help their employees to prepare themselves are far more likely to stay in business. And I think that is a fractal for all aspects of disaster management. Jim talked really, I think, eloquently about the importance of personal preparedness and family preparedness. And I think what we're in is a space with COVID where we have an opportunity to sort of revisit the concept of what does personal preparedness and family preparedness look like? What does resilience look like at the individual level, and then at the neighborhood level, and then at the business and institutional level, and then I think at the societal level. And one of the things we know is that organizations that prepare and don't prepare for one thing or another thing, but prepare themselves broadly for the what could happen in their future, tend to fare better, right? They tend to be more resilient, better able to bounce back from disasters. And I think the other thing is I think we're at a point in sort of history where we're looking at, our industry is looking at disasters differently. And we're no longer looking at like a broad brush approach to how does everybody recover from a disaster, because there is no monolithic everybody, right? We have to be looking at individual communities and individual people. And I think we're starting to look at that much more with an eye towards underserved populations, historically under-resourced communities, and then especially looking at expanding our perspective to include a more diverse set of inputs and experiences that define how we want to build our community after a disaster.
Marc, Clint touched on a variety of key issues that we're grappling with and important points to focus on: resilience within the community, the disproportionate impact of these situations and threats on certain communities, and a number of the other steps that are being taken. Your work at Georgetown, you've seen a lot, and we all were students at one time. How do students be better prepared, better involved, and more informed about what Clint just talked about, the issues that Jim also mentioned, and what you and I have been talking about here for a little bit too? How do you help them to remain informed, prepared, and involved in these questions and issues that are affecting them in all of our region? And then importantly, how do you get beyond what sometimes as young adults is a sense of complacency that I know is something that we face on college campuses just in general, but on this issue in particular?
Sure. That's an excellent question. And it's very challenging, right? I mean, our students are very smart and very focused and dedicated to doing well in their academic studies, and they're involved in their communities. At the same time, they tend to have this complacency and this altruism around their level of risk and vulnerability, because they're young people who tend to think that these threats are not going to involve them, and that we at the university level and the community level and the government level are here to protect them and to prevent those things from happening to them. I think part of it is, as Clint and Jim talked about eloquently, is shifting the focus to looking internally, right? To building that internal culture, that education. I always say this, preparedness is a journey, it's not a destination. We're never fully prepared. We have to be prepared for the threats and hazards that we're most vulnerable to. And we need to really remind our population about those threats and hazards in a way that's not, we're not trying to be threatening. We're not trying to be to instill fear, but more to instill a natural respect for the uncertainty that exists in society around the threats and hazards and the things that they need to do to be prepared for those threats and hazards. And by reinforcing the fundamentals, right? Understanding the hazards, having a plan, staying informed, getting your community emergency alerts, participating in different activities and trainings on campus. We do Stop the Bleed, we do CPR, first aid, et cetera. All the things that we can do at the grassroots level to educate our communities about preparedness will help no matter what the situation. If it's a car accident, a natural disaster, an active shooter, or an act of cyber terrorism. It's really about focusing on the threats and the hazards, and then teaching and reinforcing these basic, simple preparedness steps that will help them feel more empowered and able to kind of respond to those situations when they occur in the community.
Good morning, everyone who's just joined us. We're talking about emergency preparedness with Jim Sheaffer, American Red Cross, Clint Osborn from the DC Homeland Security Emergency Management, and Marc Barbiere of Georgetown Emergency Management. Please ask questions through the chat. We'll love to discuss those as we continue to move forward with this important and timely conversation. Jim, you and I talked recently about, as you once said, you said to me in this conversation, we are only as prepared for the next disaster from the last disaster, if I'm paraphrasing you correctly. What do you mean by that? And what have you, in your legacy at the American Red Cross, seen as important ways in which to learn from the past and to move forward with a better sense of how to prepare for the myriad of situations that the region is facing?
Sure. Well, both Clint and Marc have talked about the importance of having a plan. And we at Red Cross certainly believe that's the case. Everybody needs to have a plan. One of the challenges we have is that a lot of historians often remark that the militaries are always best prepared to fight the last war. And that is applicable to the whole subject of emergency preparedness. After 9/11, we got ready for the next 9/11. After COVID, we're getting ready for the next COVID. but it's highly likely that whatever major disaster confronts us next is not going to look like either one of those. So the question is, how do you learn from those kinds of disasters and have a plan that's robust enough to deal with some event that you probably maybe even not be able to conceive of? And so I think it's the importance of thinking broadly about preparedness. For example, in COVID, I think one of the things we learned is that we're accustomed to dealing with events of rather short durations. Hurricanes come and go. They may have some lasting effects, but they don't last all that long. COVID has lasted for a couple of years. So businesses in particular have had to really confront the issue of how do I take care of my employees? I can't function as a business unless my employees can come to work, unless they can feel comfortable coming to work, and in some cases, unless their families are secure. So I think that that's forced businesses to think more broadly about how do I deal with issues of mental health? How do I deal with certainly the issue of remote working? How do I deal with a whole set of new issues that I didn't really worry too much about in the context of an event like, say, 9/11? So I think going forward, it's having plans today at both the individual and the corporate level that are broad and are flexible to deal with some unknowns that we may face going forward in the future. And importantly, we need to test those plans periodically to make sure they actually work. It doesn't do you any good as an individual to have all your flashlights in the closet ready to go and then have the batteries be dead. It doesn't do you much good if your whole plan for connecting with your employees depends on texting and using cell phones if cell phones are down, which could happen in a major disaster. So you have to think carefully about how you plan, and you have to test the plan and make sure it's going to work in what we might think of as a reasonable kind of circumstances you might face.
Clint, Jim talked about having a plan. And part of having plans is feeling confident in your plan. How confident are you that the plans that we have afoot in the region are going to help us meet the challenges that we've talked about, that we are going through here, and give us a certainty, if you will, in the community that our agencies, the three here and the many more that sit around this table and think about this every day, are doing everything possible to address and prepare and help us come through? How confident are you about these plans?
Well, I think one of the big takeaways, and to expand beyond the conversation of COVID, the last couple of years in the district has been a bit of a roller coaster, right? We started with COVID. We started COVID in a year where we were planning for an inauguration. And that's usually a 12-month planning process in and of itself, which we postponed as long as we could while we figured out what COVID was going to do and what our elections were going to do. We had civil unrest. We had an insurrection at the United States Capitol building. We've had a lot of different types of incidents. And so what I would say is that what I am confident in is that our systems are robust and resilient. They're never, ever perfect, and they're never without areas for improvement. But what I focus on, I agree, planning is absolutely critical. I mean, I'm a planner by training and by trade. But I think what we have to keep in mind is that, to Jim's point, we're never going to write a plan for the disaster that's in front of us, right? We're never going to be able to pull something off the shelf and say, oh, I got a plan for this, and if I do these 10 steps, then we're going to solve that problem, right? What I do know is that through effective leadership and through effective coordination across our jurisdictions, with our businesses, with our colleges and universities and the nonprofit sector, we do have a lot of resiliency in the region. And that is where I sort of like, that's what gives me some level of comfort, not so much that all the plans are written, but that we have continued to demonstrate that working together, we can achieve big things in troubling times.
You mentioned our region being confronted with so much, 20 large-scale events, if I have my math correctly, in a cost of over $1 billion in damages. These disasters are expensive. Preparing for them are expensive, of course. And so we've seen what the impact can be, both from a human standpoint and a financial toll. And it seems like with all the problems continuing, that this problem is only accelerating. So, Marc, what kind of resources exist within the university system, whether it's Georgetown or across the city, to help businesses, and Georgetown is one of the largest businesses, if you will, in the city, to assist with these kind of damages and also the human toll? I mean, I want to start to get our conversation into mental health and the resiliency that has been talked about, and get into the impact of disproportionate impact on communities. But let's first start with, how do we pay for these disasters when they happen?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think there's several ways to answer that question, right? And the first and foremost is, preparedness is expensive, but the cost of not preparing is far more expensive. And the goal is really to ensure that you reduce the risk on your organization and also reduce the impact of whatever the disaster is on the community that you serve. And so the first thing you need to do is you need to identify what resources you have available internally. And I think looking within first is a great place to start, but then identifying those partnerships and opportunities to work with other collaborators to help bolster your preparedness end state, right? So, we do a lot of work here at Georgetown. We've invested a lot of our financial capital, if you will, and our human capital on preparing for emergencies. We redeployed a large segment of our workforce during COVID to respond to the pandemic. That had a toll. We had to deal with the mental and the social implications on our student population and the isolation that came along with it. So there's really a lot that has to be done now after the fact to help us recover. And much of that is those are net zero or net negative sums, right? You're not going to recoup those costs. I mean, no FEMA reimbursement is going to pay you back for the loss of learning or the loss of social will or capital or the impact of those types of situations. That's really not something you can balance out on a balance sheet. So really, you have to look at what's most worthwhile to your organization, and find ways within to invest in those programs and to invest in those activities. And then you reach out to your partners in the Red Cross, your partners on the Board of Trade, your partners in the National Capital Region across the Council of Governments. There's lots of ways that we can work together to share resources, to build programs collaboratively. And some of those don't require any financial investment, right? They just require the investment of time and effort to build those successful programs. And really, once you've done that, you can kind of sustain and maintain that culture in your organization. And that's going to sustain you through the next emergency, through the next disaster, whatever that might be.
Jim, I'm curious. We have a lot of disasters, of course, that happen across the country, and of course, not just here and across the globe. How do those listening to this conversation, how should we be thinking about what happens in California or in New York or in Texas or in Florida, whether it's violence, whether it's climate change related issues, whether it's natural disasters of another type, or some other serious threat? How does that impact our region, and what should businesses be thinking about, if you will, when they see these incidents and threats and disasters take place outside of our region?
Well, I think that certainly in this region, we don't face the kind of threat of wildfires that, say, is faced in a state like California. On the other hand, increasingly, we're seeing instances of those types of disasters beginning to affect this area more. The incidences of more frequent flooding, for example. We're seeing more of that on the East Coast now than we saw 20 years ago. So I think in terms of looking at other parts of the country or even other parts of the world, I think it's trying to look at them with the idea of what can we learn from that. Certainly in the Red Cross, we deploy our people nationally and in some cases internationally. So if there's a disaster in Kentucky, it's quite likely that some number of volunteers from this area are going to deploy down to Kentucky to help. And so that the Red Cross views its resources as nationwide resources. So when those resources come back from those kinds of events, they bring back the knowledge and the experience they've learned, and they try to apply it back into our region, so that we're not, as I said, we're not going to see likely not see massive wildfires on the East Coast, but we do see the impact of fires. We do see the need for example, hanging smoke alarms in homes throughout this area to reduce the risk of death in the case of a house fire. So we do try to redeploy the learning we get from other parts of the country back to this area. The one challenge I think we face is, and going back to some comments both Clint and Marc have made, is that large businesses have the capacity to deal with these kinds of issues from a planning perspective. They have risk management organizations, they have a senior vice president in charge, and they are pretty good at thinking about continuity of operations and thinking about what they would have to do in the case of a disaster. One of the big problems is mid-sized businesses and small businesses don't have that capacity often. So they often, as a result, don't put together very robust plans, and they only think about it when the disaster is right in front of them. So I think one of the things we as a community need to do is help small businesses and medium-sized businesses think through the process of how do we prepare for a disaster and have the resources available to them. And all of three of us here do. The Red Cross has a ready rating program. We try to work with businesses to think about what kind of things do you need to think about when you prepare yourself for an upcoming disaster. So I think that's helping that segment of our business community is a really important task for all of us.
Clint, 2 points I want to pull out of what Jim just described. One, the implications of disasters or situations outside of the region that have impact for us. Let's just talk about gun violence and the epidemic and sort of how this region confronts what is happening, not just elsewhere, but happens here too, and sort of what the implications of that are. I also, like all of you, can remember not too long ago, the threats that impacted our gas supplies and the lines that we had in Washington, D.C. That started outside of our region. We have an electrical grid, as we all know, that is aging, not just here, but elsewhere in the country, implications as well. How do you at DC Homeland Security and Emergency Management think about helping this region orient itself with threats that are thousands of miles away, but have immediate impact, if you will, here, and how we then prepare and move forward for that? And the second point coming from Jim is how do you as a small business, those listening to this conversation, prepare when you don't have all those resources in place that the larger businesses may have?
Yeah, so I'll tackle those in reverse order because one is very concrete and the other is supply chain, which I absolutely want to geek out over with this group. The first is how do we prepare small businesses, especially those that don't have the resources? So one is my challenge to all the large businesses is that if you don't have an enterprise risk management program or an enterprise risk manager or an emergency manager or a business continuity manager, think about hiring one. Marc talked about how challenging it is to sort of justify that investment, but businesses that are still open, businesses that thrive, we can look at and we can point to their business continuity and their emergency management programs that help them do that. So that's our, again, Jim made, I think, a really salient point, which is that our big businesses have the resources, and it's often tough to quantify because they're not profit centers for your organization, they're cost centers. But I would challenge our large organizations to really think about how to do that. I think for our smaller businesses, the two things I would focus on are business continuity, right? Like, how do I keep my doors open? What are my services that I absolutely must execute in order to bring revenue in the door, right? And build a simple business continuity plan. And there are tools at ready.dc.gov or the FEMA Ready program. You can Google FEMA Ready. And those programs, they have templates and toolkits and things that as a small business, the Red Cross has tools. They have templates and toolkits that you can fill out that will get you started and that will get you started asking the right questions. And then, at the business to business level, you can think to yourself, well, maybe I want to go out and find a contractor that can help me take the next step. The other thing we can provide, we provide through our Business Emergency Operations Center, at least in the District of Columbia, but I know a lot of our partner local jurisdictions the counties, Fairfax, Arlington, Alexandria, Montgomery, Prince George's, Prince William. We have what we call business emergency operations centers. And traditionally, those are not the brick and mortar emergency operations centers. But in our case, that's 2 members of our staff that focus on business needs and supply chains during emergencies. And if you're a business in the District of Columbia, and even some of our partners around the region who have business or staff in the district, join our business emergency operations center. And then before, like during steady state, but then also before and during emergencies like supply chain emergencies, like the Colonial Pipeline shutdown, we gather information from the businesses and we push information to the businesses. And I think at the business level, that's the same thing as learning to stop the bleed or do CPR, right? Is what are my connection points to others that can help me sort of weather this storm? And then I think the larger issue that I think beyond public health preparedness, which I'll defer to Marc on because it's really his bailiwick, is one of the things that COVID really brought up for us is supply chains. And so a couple of years ago, probably 5 or 6 years ago now, we actually implemented a full-time supply chain program. So we have a member of our staff that focuses on critical infrastructure and supply chain, and he's part of the 2-person duo that runs our Business Emergency Operations Center. And what we do is, we look at the National Capital Region and we work our way up, we work our way up down, and we work our way west to really understand what our connection points are around key commodities. So for fuel, it's everything coming out of the Gulf. For food, a lot of the food and other supplies we get come out of like the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. And so we're constantly monitoring across the region and across the country what's going on weather-wise, what's going on supply-wise, what's going on impacts-wise, because if we see a Gulf Coast hurricane that's going to hit the Louisiana area, we start asking ourselves, what's this going to do to our supply chain, right? For fuel, for other petroleum commodities. And what that allows us to do is start to map into our local infrastructure, folks like Georgetown and the hospitals and all of our dialysis centers and all the folks who are not just dependent on our power grid, but also then dependent on backup fuel supplies. So I think of it as a web where you have a lot of lines out and then you have a lot of lines connecting across the lines that are going out. And that's really how we look at that. And that's how we've tried to become a little bit more innovative and a little bit more forward looking. And I would also stress that that's a regional approach, right? So the warehouse, the CNS wholesaler warehouse that serves the District of Columbia also serves everyone else in the National Capital Region. And so as we think about how to support our businesses, especially when a disaster is going on, whether that's open or closed roads, whether that's flooding, more and more as we consider how to respond and support those businesses, we're doing that at the regional table. So we're having a conversation at the regional table that says, you have a need over here, you have a need over here, we have a need over here. What's the order of operations for local government services that need to happen to allow our private sector to get back in there and deliver those services?
Marc, I want to turn the conversation now and a pivot to the people, the communities. We've talked about mental health. We've talked about the implications of trauma around experiencing so much, so often, and to such a degree, given the myriad of situations that this region faces, both locally in the region, but also looking out, is what more needs to be done in order to make sure that we are addressing the toll on humans, if you will, our communities, our employees, in the face of not just after a disaster takes place and in the aftermath of that, but also preparing or not knowing. I think it's fair to say that we live in a time now of great uncertainty and a lot of people feeling afraid for a variety of reasons. How do we start to address that? And how are you all at Georgetown working to make sure that we're giving some sense of certainty, some sense of that our plans and the efforts that we're making are going to help reduce some of that collective community anxiety and the toll that it's taking?
And that's a great question. And I think, you know, one of the things that we always look to is when you give people the tools, the capability, the strength to feel that they can overcome and triumph over challenges, that's very empowering at the individual and the community level, right? And so if we build capacity in our communities to be resilient and to be prepared and strengthen at the grassroots level across our communities, starting with our young people, right? Starting when they're in school and through community-based organizations and faith-based organizations and, you know, scouting and all the different ways that we can engage our young people before they even get to the university level, before they even become functional adults. That's a very powerful way to build resilience across our community. Clint and Jim have talked a lot about whole community and preparing for what's coming next and not knowing what that is. And that can be very, very scary to a lot of folks, not understanding risk and not understanding what to do to be prepared. And I think if we as educators, if we as community leaders, if we as, folks who are out there talking about preparedness every day to our constituents, to our colleagues, to our community members, if we can just think about that for a second, we all are very powerful because we've achieved this power through getting some self-control over what the future holds for us. And our activities allow us to do that. And we have to kind of transfer that outward to the community because they're really, the weakest link is the unprepared community member, right? Whether it's a hurricane, an active shooter, or an act of cyber terrorism, or whatever the threat may be, it's the unprepared community member that's the weakest link in the chain. It's the unprepared business, it's the unprepared university, it's the unprepared hospital. And so resilience starts at the grassroots level, and it's that cultural shift towards that preparedness mindset that will get us there. And that empowerment of our community members will help to rise the tide, if you will, of preparedness and make us a much more prepared, resilient community overall, I think.
Jim, how does the American Red Cross think about the question of community resiliency, the disproportionate impact and implications for disadvantaged communities when disasters take place, or just preparing for disaster, questions of mental health and other related issues? How does the American Red Cross think about these issues?
Well, I think in an area like the National Capital Region that is incredibly diverse, we think about the international community, a huge number of people who come from different parts of the world, different parts of the country, and settle here to work for either a long time or a short time, that we have a real challenge. The Red Cross is, we basically operate through volunteers. If we don't have volunteers, we don't function. So we need to attract to the Red Cross people who want to help in the community. And that means attracting into the Red Cross as volunteers, people who represent the community. When we go to a fire in an Hispanic neighborhood, if all of our volunteers speak only English, that's a problem. We need to be able to relate to the communities that we serve, and we need to have people who can project a lot of the things we've been talking about into the communities. Because we have volunteers, we have a lot of people who do other things during the day. And they help us in the evenings. Maybe the retired help us full time, but they live in these communities. And if we can help get them to go out and help take the message into the communities, that helps with preparedness. If your neighbor's talking to you about, hey, by the way, do you have a go bag in the event you have to evacuate your home? And do you have your medications? That probably resonates a lot more than one of us sitting here and talking to people that way. So we recognize that this is a very diverse community. We need to be concerned about people with disabilities. What happens if we have to evacuate people with disabilities? Most businesses, I know when I was in the business community, we had identified anybody who had mobility issues. If we had to evacuate the building, that somebody was responsible for making sure that those people got out. So we need to think about the community broadly, but also in detail. And that for us means trying to attract more people to volunteer for the Red Cross, so we're better prepared to deal with those kinds of issues in those communities. But I think it's a real, and I should also mention the blood supply. The Red Cross, one of our major responsibilities is to supply blood to hospitals and institutions that need it. But there's a crying need in our community for blood to deal with people with sickle cell disease. And so being able to communicate into the community, we need help from people who can donate blood, from the African-American community in particular, that we can then use to support the needs of people from that community. We really have a program to try and focus on that, but it's a realization that there's a lot of different, we have a large community, but at the grassroots level, this community is composed of hundreds and hundreds of smaller communities, all of which have to be served in a response to a disaster.
We have about 10 to 12 minutes left. I want to go to a question that's come through, Clint, in the chat. The question is, what lessons, technologies, or plans have been implemented since 9/11 to make for a safe and orderly regional response to the possibility of a major incident? Clint, how do you respond to that question?
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, which is the body that sort of convenes all of the governments, as well as a lot of the other folks on this call, our colleges and universities. The Red Cross is a huge player in our Homeland Security and emergency programs. And we've had, actually within the National Capital Region, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments and the local jurisdictions have been very, it predates, a lot of our regional work actually predates 9/11. Last year, as the 20th anniversary of 9/11, we did a symposium about interoperable communications, right? Like how does one emergency responder talk to another? How does an emergency responder talk to their operations center, to the 911 centers? You know, Licy, I know being at APCO, that's a big deal for you guys. And one of the key points of that was that 9/11 created a new reason for us to do that. But even looking back to historically, train derailments, airline crashes in the National Capital Region, we were very, very sort of like regionally focused as far back as the 90s, right? But that said, 9/11 took it to a whole new level. I will just talk about one thing that I think really just sort of summarize it, which is a concept called the Regional Emergency Coordination Plan, which is it's a very simple, very straightforward mechanism whereby during an emergency, we have a series of coordination calls that we can escalate to bring people from different disciplines, whether that's the police chiefs, the fire chiefs, whether that's our volunteers, whether that's our emergency managers, whether that's our 911 leadership. And we can either bring them together in silos, or we can bring them together as a whole very, very quickly, because the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments gives us a forum to do that. And I talked about how, you know, in my mind, even as a planner, the plan is not as good as the planning, right? The planning is where we really win. And so that plan is in place, and it's basically just to kickstart a regional response. It includes things like a first-hour checklist for executive leadership at the county or city level or at the state level, and what kind of questions we ask. But it's really focused on gathering information and making good decisions early in an emergency, so that we can continue to make better and better and better decisions as the emergency goes on. And that's something we used regularly during COVID. We've used regularly during other incidents throughout the region throughout the last 2.5 years.
Marc, we have about 10 minutes left. I want to turn the conversation now in these last few minutes to talk about what you and Jim and Clint see as the next potential threat to our region. And the most important question one can ask in a conversation like this around our virtual couch is are we ready for that? Marc?
Sure. Well, I learned a long time ago in my public safety background that you never predict the future, because it's going to come true. So, but I will say that my biggest concern really is, you know, the impact of climate change and weather-related disasters cannot be overlooked. Our region is vulnerable to coastal storms and hurricanes. Flooding, wind, and high temperature, being heat extremes are big challenges. And certainly the cascading effects of those, particularly on our power grid, our infrastructure, our transportation system, et cetera, is potentially huge. And so I'm concerned about that. I don't think we're as prepared as we need to be. I think we're getting a lot more prepared and better prepared, if you will, for those types of situations. But I think, and Clint and Jim would probably say this, when we see what's happened in the Gulf and other places where they've had these catastrophic storms that have wreaked havoc for weeks and weeks on end, we could have that here where, it's not as likely, but it still is likely, and it's still concerning. And I think that's one area that we can do a much better job preparing for and continuing to reinforce to our community.
What do you think is missing in there, Marc? Just to stick with you for just a moment. You said you don't think we are as prepared for these types of threats as we could be. What's one action do you think that can be taken to help make sure that we are prepared or come closer to preparation?
Sure. I mean, I think, and I don't make this up. I've heard this from leaders in the weather world, in the meteorological and the climate change world. There's this disavowing of science and this disavowing of the actual impact that a storm could have on our region. People do not think we are vulnerable here to a coastal hurricane or a coastal storm. And we talk about the history of events like Agnes and other historical events, and people go, well, that happened 50 years ago. That's not something that's going to happen nowadays. And we're actually a lot more vulnerable now because of deforestation and the population development and the urban landscape than we were back then. So I think that is one of the most concerning situations, is this head in the sand kind of ostrich approach to climate change and climate disasters. That really does scare me.
Jim, what concerns you about our preparedness for the kind of threats that you see are preparing for in our future?
Well, I would agree with Marc that the whole climate situation is creating some the potential for some dramatic events that would affect our region. But I think on top of that, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that we learned from COVID is if you have a long duration event, so as a foundation, the likelihood is you're going to have events on top of that event. So being prepared, and I think this is more about flexibility and resilience than anything else, being prepared to deal with situations that are cascading, I think is a real challenge, and really forces us to think very carefully about how we would react to the situation. I'll give you an example of during COVID. One of the challenges for the Red Cross is that we, as I mentioned, were involved and integral to the process of supplying blood to hospitals and other institutions. And when COVID hit, one of our major sources of blood supply was to go to corporations and have blood drives and to go to various places to have blood drives. Well, all of a sudden, we couldn't do that. The corporations were working remotely. Places that we ordinarily would go to were closed. We had to depend more and more on our being able to expand our ability to collect blood in centralized blood donation centers. Our volunteers were exposed to COVID. They couldn't come and help. Our donors may have had COVID and couldn't donate. So the thought about what are we going to do if we have a major event that restricts our supply chain, and then we have another event on top of it, how are we going to deal with that? And a lot of that deals with, from Red Cross point of view, as I mentioned earlier, we're a nationwide organization. So fortunately, we can draw on resources from outside our region if we have to. But the need to be able to do things more flexibly and to think about the resilience of our whole Red Cross infrastructure is for us is a real challenge, and is important for us to address it as we look forward to a situation where we may face a different kind of mosaic of disasters.
Clint, what is concerning you in Homeland Security in terms of what may be coming next in our ability as a region to tackle it effectively?
Well, I think I won't keep underscoring climate change, because Marc and Jim have really already covered it, and I think Marc rightly raises the bell. It's an existential threat. It's going to change our way of life, and especially for coastal and riverine areas, the amount of water that we could be looking to deal with that's basically lapping at our front doors is really something we need to be thinking about. I think one of the challenges that we constantly keep an eye on is cybersecurity and cyber vulnerabilities. I think the challenge with cyber is it takes us all from a very tangible disaster to a very intangible disaster. I think it's hard for folks because the cyberspace in and of itself is complex and complicated and requires a certain amount of expertise, but it's also not something we can touch and put our hands on. And so I think, it's easy to put our head in the sand and act like, our service providers are doing that for us. And I think that's a really dangerous assumption. It's something we keep an eye on at the community level, because one cyber incident is enough to bankrupt a small organization. It doesn't take much. And especially as our smaller businesses to mid-sized businesses become more reliant on service providers to do business functions like accounting and revenue collection that they would traditionally have done themselves, it's now incumbent upon them, instead of asking whether they have a backup to do collection internally, they now have to ask how much do I trust my revenue collection service provider to do that for me, and what does their business plan look like? And I think the last thing, and Marc touched on this, is misinformation and disinformation and the erosion of truth. If I take a step back into the Homeland Security space more than the emergency management space, I believe it's an existential threat to our country. I believe it's an existential threat to our democracy, and I believe that it's challenging a lot of the very critical human and neighborhood level links that allow us to do the things that Jim talked about: build resiliency, build relationships, look out for our neighbors. There's an increasing polarization in our politics. There's an increasing polarization in the news that we can intake, and I'm really concerned because I think it erodes the fabric of our nation, and a lot of our resiliency in our communities are in our neighborhoods and in interpersonal relationships. And so I think, that's something that we have been really keeping an eye on lately.
Clint Osborn, DC Homeland Security, Emergency Management; Marc Barbiere, Georgetown University; and Jim Sheaffer, American Red Cross here in the Capital Region. Thank you all for a very timely and powerful conversation, which I know has helped us to be better prepared, better informed, and more involved. And all the work that you and so many do day in, day out to help make sure that we are prepared and are thinking about our communities, our businesses, big and small, as well as the people who are all impacted by the work that you all do here. So thank you very much for joining us today. I want to turn it back to Jack McDougall, who is going to offer a few words of closing. And I want to thank the Greater DC Board of Trade for hosting the conversation, and check out the recording of this when it goes back out. And thank you very much for joining us today. Jack?
Great, thanks, Licy, and thank you for facilitating the conversation today. Really important, and it needs to be a priority for all of our organizations, probably more so now than ever, and then, particularly the conversation around cyber. There's not enough we can do to protect ourselves from cyber events. So I just want to thank you, Clint, Jim, and Marc. Really good conversation. Thank you for taking the time. And really want to thank McGuireWoods again for sponsoring this series of conversations. I do want to point out we were having some Zoom problems today, and a number of people who registered were emailing that they weren't able to log in. I think we have finally resolved that. However, some folks were not able to participate with us. But we will quickly get out this recording for folks so that they can share in the insights that were provided today. So again, thank you for all of that. And to stay tuned, we have another webinar coming up on energy and resources. We'll be sending out information on that. And with that, I'll close this and thank everybody for joining us today. Have a great day. Thank you.